All right, so in this video I'm going to be talking about dissociative disorders. And these are disorders where part of the mind becomes dissociated from the rest of the person. So this, what is your mind? That's what we study in psychology. We study the psyche, the mind, the soul is a sort of interchangeable word, I believe, in Greek, where psyche comes from. But essentially it's, this aspect of us, which we commonly refer to as the mind, and I would say that probably includes your memories, your identity, who you feel you are, and as well as your sense of consciousness, of being aware of what's around you and what's going on, and those things, that your identity, memory, and consciousness are altered in some significant way, such that it causes a problem for you when you have a dissociative disorder. So in terms of consciousness, that's probably the hardest one to understand. There's two alterations of consciousness that sometimes occur in dissociative disorders. One is called depersonalization, and that's just where you feel this distorted perception of reality. And derealization is where you feel like the stuff around you isn't even real, or you might not even be really aware of what's around you. You kind of lose your sense of the external world. So these are the types of things that get distorted or impaired in dissociative disorders. Now I'll introduce the 4 dissociative disorders which exist. I can get my slide to advance. Okay. So the 4 that I'll talk about are depersonalization disorder, dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, and dissociative identity disorder. And I'll go into dissociative fugue in a bit more detail, and then I'll talk about dissociative identity disorder in a lot of detail. But first, to give you a quick one on depersonalization disorder and dissociative amnesia. Depersonalization disorder is just where that depersonalization thing, where you kind of have a distorted perception of reality, happens to you regularly, and it's disturbing for you, it causes dysfunction for you, and that's what the disorder basically is. Dissociative amnesia is where you have some form of profound memory loss, where you kind of forget who you are, even, or you forget your life's history, and it usually it's extremely rare for this to happen, in the absence of a major head injury or whatever, or some sort of neurological degeneration. But this is, none of that stuff is happening. You don't have Alzheimer's disease or anything, but you kind of forget who you are, or you forget something major stuff from your life, like years of your life or something. That would be dissociative amnesia. And it's very rare. Dissociative fugue is the first one I'll talk about in detail. Is basically the same thing as dissociative amnesia, interestingly. It is, you have this memory loss, where it's retrograde, meaning you have a loss of memories from the past. You've lost some aspect of your past. That would be as opposed to anterograde amnesia. That's where you can't get new memories. But retrograde is what happens in dissociative fugue and dissociative amnesia. And what happens is there's this flight, or this travel. You flee from your home, from your town, and you usually go somewhere very far away. And usually it's something like, you end up at a diner in Wichita, Kansas, and you're like, huh. And the person at the diner says, hey, are you from around here? Haven't seen you here before. And you're like, huh, I don't know. Actually can't remember who I am. Or you might say, yeah, I'm from around here. And you kind of create, you kind of assume that you must be from around there because you're there and you don't really remember your past. So you might kind of develop this new identity on the fly, but you start to realize, wow, I really don't remember who I am, basically. So you often assume a new identity. And it appears that, you really think you are this person that you've kind of made up, and you've forgotten all the stuff that you really are. So this is, I think, a fascinating disorder. It's probably the rarest of all psychological disorders. We usually talk about like 1% or 13% of the population will get social phobia, 1% will have schizophrenia. This is like, 1 in a million or less than that. So not a lot is really known about it. Tends to occur in adulthood. It onsets rapidly, so you just up and leave your town and you go to this new place with a new identity, forgetting your old identity, and then it kind of goes away. You're like, oh, huh, I remember. Then you go back home. It usually happens in women. So no one really knows why it happens, but trauma and life stress are probably part of the story. Having had a major trauma is, I believe, usually the case for people who have this disorder, if not always the case, and there's often a lot of life stress going on when the person is. It usually resolves without treatment. In other words, you don't have to really do treatment because the person remembers who they are and they go back home, and that's kind of the end of it. So that's dissociative fugue. You can tell your family about that one at Thanksgiving because that's an interesting one. You may also want to talk about this one. So this is what the remainder of the talk will focus on of this video, which is DID, dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. This is the one some people get confused. They think schizophrenia means this. They think split. They're smart. They know schizo means split, and they think it means split personalities, but that's not what it means. We talked about that when we talked about schizophrenia. This is what they're thinking. They're thinking of DID, or multiple personality disorder, but now it's called DID, dissociative identity disorder. So what is this? Let's start with clinical description, as we always do, phenomenology. What is it like to have this? And there's often an amnesia where you forget aspects of your life. And the way that works is it's chunked into different personalities. So there's multiple personalities that emerge within one person. They're very distinct. There's new identities. That the different personalities are called alters, and there have to be at least 2 for you to have this disorder, but there could be 100 different personalities within one person. I think the average is about 15. But they each have their own unique characteristics. They have their own things that they remember or don't remember. And there's kind of one personality who's called the host, who is, I think, the closest thing to what you'd say is like the real person, or the person who existed before these different personalities did. And you can switch from one personality to the next. So let's watch a little clip of someone with this disorder. You can see it happening.
Chrissy, I don't want you doing the strawberries.
I can wash them though, right?
And Papa, he has to have his coffee.
Then my mom does.
And Chrissy wants to have her juice.
I want to know where the pink donuts are.
Breakfast time is a busy time at the Patillo home. The only place busier than the kitchen is Christine Patillo's mind.
I'm just extra special.
Tristan, you are extra special.
I love you. I love you. But I love me.
What do we have going?
Cindy was just out.
Christine has 6 other personalities called alters
Am I Aunt Daddy?
living inside her head.
You don't like blueberries in your pancakes either, do you?
I don't actually mind them. She despises fruit.
All distinct and different, all with their own voice.
I can hear them if I'm paying attention. They can look out through my eyes, and they can see what's ever in my peripheral.
I got one more.
Sure.
Try out.
That is 2-year-old Cindy. The rest of the gang, as they're called, will introduce themselves.
Wait, I'm Christine.
I'm Chrissy. I'm Tristan, the lone male.
I'm she. I am Q. I do all the beads. I'm Rim.
Christine has dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. It's recognized by the American Psychiatric Association and affects just a fraction of 1% of the population.
I, of course, always get the blame.
Who's my wife gonna partner up with?
I'll be the shuffler.
Doctors say Christine's brain got shuffled, fractured is the clinical term, when she was a little girl.
But I just seem to be going the wrong direction all the time.
And that's different from when?
Funny.
Oh, that's what I'm going to do. Here, shebang.
That didn't work out well for me at all.
Christine suffered physical and emotional abuse from her father throughout her childhood and what can be politely described as torturous sexual abuse at the hands of a neighbor from the ages of 7 to 9. Her childhood, a cruel game of survival.
That was complete being imprisoned in my mind.
Drawings Christine did in therapy show the violent battles inside her head. Doctors say when the brain can't handle any more abuse, it fractures into different personalities, and each one often serves a purpose. Instead of Christine suffering the sexual abuse, Rim, a tough tomboy, would appear and absorb the shame. The alter She, a gruff 30-year-old lesbian, would come out and take on the abuse from Christine's father. But as Christine got older, the personalities that once protected her turned.
But there's a little bit of a triangle scar from a tip of an iron.
Rim led Christine to the dangerous world of drugs and promiscuity. Christine waking in places with people she didn't remember. Alter She was the worst abuser.
And we have a scar on in our hairline from when she smashed a picture frame. She used to smash pots and pans on us, and we'd have really big gnarly bruises and burns. Burning was a big thing.
It went on for years.
It's so frightening to feel like you don't have access to your mind or can keep control, or that people think that you're a freak or that something's going on.
It's been a trying 26 years of marriage, to say the least, for Christopher. The couple never had children because between Christopher, Christine, and her 6 other personalities, 8 was enough. He's been husband, father, friend, and enemy, often all within the same 60-second span. The diagnosis 10 years ago answered a lot of questions for him. One question, however, never needed answering.
Why did you stay?
This is my life, and this is my wife, and it's a beautiful thing, and I love being on the journey with her. Whoop, 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 whoop. Come on.
Come on, Dixie girl.
Let's go for a walk, Dixie. Come on.
After 2 decades of therapy, Christine has come to control the people living in her head.
But all is well.
It is.
The abuse from her other personalities has stopped, and Christine lives a relatively routine life. In fact, the alters are actually helping her to better integrate into society.
These are my bead people. Everything I make is one of a kind.
This is Q, who has started her own small business selling beaded jewelry. Christine watches Q do this from inside her own head and feels inspired to do more in public herself. For Q, it's more about changing others, not the 6 alters.
Different is uncomfortable for a lot of people, and we're just trying to make our different not be so spooky or so confusing to people.
One major step in that direction, the book Christine has written about her experience. One face with 7 voices, hoping to bring understanding and acceptance to a disorder so hard to comprehend.
We're at a place where...
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Okay, so that video gave you a sense of what it's like. In the DSM, this is the official definition. You have to have the presence of 2 or more distinct identities or personality states. And each has to have its own relatively enduring pattern of perceiving, relating to, or thinking about the environment or self. In other words, 2 or more distinct personalities. At least 2 of these have to take control of the person's behavior regularly, and you have to be unable to recall important information that is like too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. And then finally, this isn't due to the fact that you're on drugs or something, or that you have a brain injury or something like that. So that's the definition of DID. The prevalence, I hesitate to say, is 1.5%. That's a statistic I think from your textbook, but I'll talk about that in a minute, about how difficult it is to estimate the true prevalence of this disorder. It's usually in women 9-to-1 ratio, so only 10% or whatever of cases are men. Usually onset is in childhood, and there's a lot of comorbidity. So there's a lot of other disorders that these people have, whether they be Axis 1 disorders like depression, PTSD, very common, or Axis 2 disorders, personality disorders, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or other ones. So it's usually a lifelong chronic course too. So what causes this? Well, severe abuse is part of the story here in almost all cases. So there's links to PTSD with this. There's a lot of overlap. You know, a lot of people with DID also have PTSD because a lot of people with DID have severe trauma histories. There's also maybe some kind of biological spin or understanding to the etiology where, you know, there's people with DID tend to have a very reactive physiology. And there's differences in their hippocampus, which is, you know, memory formation center in our brain, and amygdala, which is a fear responding. You know, there's differences that have been shown in people with DID in those areas. People with DID are also highly suggestible in general. So if you recall from, well, I don't know if you'll recall. I recall from when I was graduating high school, and we did this thing where there was a sleepover at the school on the night of our graduation, and we hired this hypnotist to come and entertain the class. And we were all sitting in the auditorium, and he had some people come up, and he, you know, hypnotized them and made them cluck like a chicken and stuff and do silly things. And it was amazing to see people's getting in these altered states of consciousness from this hypnotist. And it turns out that the hypnotist is clever. He selects people to come up who are highly suggestible, people who are going to be able to be hypnotized. Not everyone can be hypnotized. And some people much more so than others. And the hypnotist, if he's a good hypnotist or she is, will choose people who are suggestible, able to be hypnotized. And it turns out people with DID tend to be quite suggestible, tend to be able to be hypnotized. So that's some aspects of the causes. Let's do a little bit of the theory, like how might it work, type of understanding of the cause, like we did for, you know, anxiety disorders, where it's about maintaining, you know, cycle of avoidance and stuff. So I'm going to give you three perspectives on this. The first one is going to be psychodynamic perspective, which is not usually one we start with in this class, but this one is an interesting one. So the idea here is for psychodynamic perspective is that repression of memories is something that everyone does. It's the most basic defense mechanism for psychodynamic theorists. And dissociative disorders are just an extreme version of that, of repressing memories to the extent you kind of forget who you are, or to forget an aspect of who you are. Or you're pretending, when you're kind of being someone else or pretending to be someone else, you're safely watching as these terrible things happen to you, happen to this other person, not to you. So it's kind of like repressing memories or repressing, you know, that's me. It's a defense mechanism type of a explanation of how the person is handling essentially the abuse that has happened to them. So that's psychodynamic perspective. A behavioral perspective has to do with reinforcement. And the idea is that, you know, everybody's mind kind of drifts to varying states of consciousness, right? I mean, you've probably all experienced times where you're kind of out of it and in a daze or whatever. And, you know, someone said to you, like, did you get that? And you're like, what? Play that back for me again, because I was like somewhere else. And so you're kind of we all drift to some degree. And this is a mild form of dissociation in a sense. And when you're in the shit, and I'm using a military term there, you know, that's in the shit means you're like on the front lines, like in battle, your friends are dying next to you, you're scared for your life, you know, it's a terrible place to be. That's what it's like when you're getting this trauma, you know, the sexual or physical abuse as a little kid. You're in the shit. And when your mind drifts, when you're in that place, you're totally out of control. You know, people maybe that are supposed to love you are doing terrible things to you. It feels good to drift into that altered state of consciousness where, you know, you're a little out of it. And that's called negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement means the removal of a painful stimulus. So you have this painful stimulus happening, someone's doing something awful to you, you're thinking about what that means and how awful that is. And you drift into this other thing where you start thinking about something else or whatever, and that feels good. because you're removing the intensity of the stimulus that's there. So that's why that's how this forms, is you start to drift into that altered state more and more when the abuse happens, just because of reinforcement, because of negative reinforcement. And so when you have this memory loss or new identity creation, that can be really reinforcing for people. So you might drift into another state and then even pretend to be someone else, or get in touch with aspects of you that you feel like are someone else other than the person this is happening to, almost like you're watching it happening to them, not you. That can feel good. It can be reinforcing. So that's a behavioral perspective. The last one is sort of partially semantically different only from the behavioral perspective. I feel like there's a lot of overlap here, but the idea here is that the person is essentially hypnotizing themselves when they're experiencing the abuse. And if you think about it, all memory is state dependent to a degree. Actually, I probably should have talked about this in depression. I think I forgot to in this class, is the notion of state dependent memory. So, do you remember that study from Intro Psych where about state dependent memory, where some people learned a list of words while they were in scuba gear, and either they learned it underwater, under the water of a pool, or they learned it like on land, and then the next day they were tested and they remembered the list better if they were again in the same environment in which they learned it. So if they learned it underwater, they remembered it better underwater. If they learned it on land, they remembered it better on land than if they were in the opposite environment. And the same is true for if you're in a particular state. If you go for a run and then you learn a list of words and you're like breathing heavily, you just finished your run, you're very aroused physiologically, you're going to remember that set of words better if you're again in a physiologically aroused state. So if you're kind of hypnotizing yourself to be in a different state during the abuse, you might not remember the abuse because you're not in that altered hypnotic state that you put yourself in. So that sort of explains the memory loss, where it's a coping mechanism for the abuse, and it ends up producing this result where you can't remember big parts of your life. So that's three potential explanations. Another potential explanation, which is an important one, is that it's an iatrogenic disorder. That is a vocabulary word for you. What does iatrogenic mean? It means it's caused by the treatment. So cancer treatments have a lot of iatrogenic effects, where you lose your hair. You might lose your voice if you're getting a lot of radiation on your throat or something like that. A lot of bad things can happen with cancer treatment that are iatrogenic. They hurt you. The treatment hurts you. And that this is a disorder where it's iatrogenic. At least a lot of people think so, that it's caused by the treatment. Where the therapist is essentially actually reinforcing the patient for expressing anything related to having different identities, or doing hypnosis and suggesting maybe you do have a different identity, and the therapist essentially creates this disorder. That is another possibility. So I think there's possibilities, and the first three things I just said, these three perspectives make sense, but this is definitely also true. Maybe in most cases, that the therapist causes this disorder. And I'll explain more about that. Yeah, okay. Just trying to decide when I should tell you what on what slide. So the treatment here for this is you try to it's sort of similar to PTSD. You talk through the trauma. You try to reintegrate the identities, so that there's you're kind of one person again, and you can still maybe have these different aspects to you, but they don't feel like a totally different person, and you're kind of back as a whole again. So you visualize things and work on coping strategies to try to get that integration happening. and you identify the cues or the triggers that might cause you to switch, and talk about those and what those mean, as hopefully the host. The host is, you know, the main person. All right, so now to the controversy. So I sort of alluded or directly said a minute ago that it's potentially an iatrogenic disorder caused by the therapist. So some people don't think this is even a real thing. They think it's like all made up or something. And there's a lot of disagreement in the field about that. So I'm just showing you the survey here. The question, if the DSM-4 were to be revised today, so this is an older survey from, I'd say, the early 2000s, before the DSM-5 came out, how should it treat the diagnosis of DID? And so the percentage, so 10 to 15% of people said the DID should not be in the DSM at all. 40% said it should be included, but only with reservations, like saying, we don't know much about this, more research is needed or something. And then 35% say it should be included without reservations. And 7% of people had no opinion about it. And similar numbers for dissociative amnesia, which is also like highly suspect in some people's mind. So it's very interesting. I come from the school of, you know, skeptical scientists, and I really do raise my eyebrow about it, about whether it's a real thing. But I do think there's something there. So let me say a little bit more about that. So there's been a lot of studies where people of the scientific skeptical ilk have sort of tried to disprove it, or see if there's anything really there. You do some studies to see what's going on here. So they have people simulate, pretend to have DID, and they have other people who actually have DID in these studies, and they say, what's the difference between these two groups? If this thing isn't real, there shouldn't be any difference between, because the people with DID are pretending too, if it's not a real thing. So there's been about 20 studies on this, and some findings have been shown repeatedly through these studies, so I think they're trustworthy. And one difference between people who are pretending to have DID and people who actually have it is the identity presentation. So DID identities have a pattern. They're usually organized around the trauma, whereas people that are pretending to have DID just make up different personalities. And they haven't had a trauma, so they can't organize those personalities around the trauma. You know, the video we just saw, there was Rim, who was sort of the tomboy, and She, who was the tough lesbian, and then the little girl, 2 years old. They all had different relationships. The vulnerable one, the innocent one, before she was scarred, you know, the little 2-year-old, or the tough one who can handle it. You know, they're all formed out of the trauma. That's not the case for people who are simulating. There's slower reaction times in DID, regardless of which identity is doing the test. So I think that, I don't know, that could be related to just severe impairment, comorbidity. There's a lot going on in these people's brains. Their brains have been through hell and back, so they have slower reaction time, people with DID. There's similarities between the groups, though, between people who are pretending to have DID and people who actually do, include the transfer of information. So between identities. So if you do a test where you say, you know, Rim is learning a set of words, and then later on you test She on that set of words, She is going to remember the set of words. Maybe not explicitly, but she will show implicit learning that she's faster in recognizing the words. Or if you do priming studies across identities where, you know, how do you spell the word hare? And if I prime you by showing a picture of a rabbit, you'd be more likely to spell it H-A-R-E as opposed to H-A-I-R. If I showed you a comb, you would be more likely to spell the word hare H-I-R. So if I prime a comb with Rim, She will then show the effects of that prime. So there's this transfer of information and memory that's occurring across identities. And that happens to simulators, that happens to people with DID. So this is interesting. I like this line of work, and I think there's more that can be learned from it. So is it real? So it depends what you mean by that. So this is the historical situation here, which is that before 1800, there were really no reported cases in history of anything like this. So there's that. Then around 1800, there were about 70 cases that were reported, not in 1800, but in the 100 years after that, between 1800 and 1920. There were about 70 cases of something like this that were reported, which is interesting. I think, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but that's also the time when our good friend Mesmer, mesmerizing, was doing his thing, and he would sort of hypnotize people for his treatments. Remember the guy who was sort of precursor to Freud? So maybe that has something to do with it. I'm not sure if this is an iatrogenic type of a disorder. But I'm not sure about that. I really know nothing about these 70 cases. I'm just totally speculating. But then after 1920, there were no other cases until 1970, when there was an explosion of cases. And now the prevalence is around 1% in society, which is, thousands and thousands of people. So what happened in 1970? Well, there was a book written, I think, in the 50s called Three Faces of Eve, which was a story about this. And then it became a mini-series on TV called Sybil. And it seems that the popularization of this concept, that this is a thing that can happen, essentially resulted in it happening a lot, which is very interesting. So that so it happens. So I think it's real. But the better question is, or another important question, maybe not the better question, is does it occur naturally in cultures where it's not expected? So in places in the world where they haven't seen the Sybil documentary, or it's not floating around in society that people know this is a thing, does it happen in those societies? And the answer is no, it does not. It has to be considered to be a possibility in people's minds for it to then happen. But that doesn't mean it's not real here. I mean, look at voodoo death syndrome. Voodoo death syndrome is something that happens in like Haitian cultures, or Caribbean cultures, including Haiti, where they believe that someone can cast a spell on you and you can die from that. And people actually die from this, that they believe someone has cast a spell on them and they die. So the power of belief is very real. Believing in something who would want to die, right? It's not like these people are like, I'm going to fake it and die. Oh, whoops, I'm dead. Like no one's going to fake it and actually die. If they want to fake it, presumably they want to get something out of it. And if you're dead, you can't get anything out of it. So I think they really believe, that the curses of voodoo can happen. And likewise, people who are getting DID really believe that they have these different personalities. Maybe it's because their therapist suggested it to them, or maybe because, they felt inklings of it from stuff they knew, and then some of the processes we were talking about before, the psychodynamic or behavioral processes kind of happened. In terms of the prevalence, right, so it's around 1%, but it's highly skewed prevalence. And what I mean by that is like the clinic I worked at in grad school, the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, very scientific clinic. All our patients who come in, we do, 2 to 4 hour interview, going through the DSM, asking yes or no questions. Have you experienced this? Have you experienced this? Very structured interview. And, we never see DID in that process. We ask, what's going on for you? And nobody comes in our door at card and says, I have multiple personalities. So you have a rate that's less than, one person in 10,000, 0.01%, less than that. But there's other places in the world where they are looking for this, and they attract people who may feel they have something like this going on. They have trauma, they've been abused, and they gravitate to centers that specialize in DID, and those are the places where therapists say, have you ever felt that maybe there's like different personalities in you? And they very much suggest that. And sometimes people are like, yeah, I guess, kind of. And the therapist will be all over that, and they'll diagnose this person with DID. Or maybe even the person will be like, no. And the therapist will be like, are you sure? You were really traumatized. Do you think maybe there's like this thing that happened where part of you was like looking on the trauma? And they're like, oh yeah, I guess I could see it that way. And the therapist will then kind of like really build on that and end up diagnosing the person with DID. So I think that's the deal. I think it's partially created in therapy, maybe partially created culturally, but it is a real thing that happens to people. So fascinating one. I think I'll stop there.